today my name's Ryan Thomas and I'm a dev from Sydney. And for the past almost year now, since January, myself and 4 other devs have been squirreled away in a little office in Sydney and working on Confluence 4.0. So that's part of what I'm going to go through with you today. And here's a brief overview. So as I mentioned, we're going to go a bit through some new features, a bit more of a look at 4.0. Some of you might have seen it at Summit when Mike gave a demo. We're going to go over a new storage format, okay? Because 4.0 introduces a new XHTML storage format. Got a good few details for you there. We're also bringing out a new API for interacting with this storage format. Migration of data from wiki markup, so old versions of Confluence, coming to 4.0. How do we convert that wiki markup to XHTML? And again, same with macros. So macros also need to be migrated. We're going to go through that, and I've got a demo for you there. So, introducing Confluence 4.0. So, may have seen it at Summit. We're bringing in this new rich text editor interface. Okay, so we've got, as you can see, better support for tables. We've got property panels, a lot of cool things like that. New layout down the bottom, new toolbar up the top. Okay, it's all going to be very cool. Introducing macro placeholders. So rather than just seeing the wiki markup in your rich text editor, you're going to see actual placeholders. You can see the cheese macro and attachments up there, no body, so they appear as a little block, and the good old trusty code macro with a nice bit of snippet of Java code there. There's also a bug in that Java code. If anyone can tell me afterwards, I'll try and wrangle up a prize. It's from Java Puzzlers. Okay, we've just got many WYSIWYG improvements, okay? So it's almost what you see is what you get, okay? With the placeholders, things like that. It's going to be really cool and awesome experience for guys using the rich text editor. And we're introducing inline wiki markup completion for a hybrid editing experience, okay? So you can type wiki markup straight into the rich text editor and have it migrated on the fly to, as you can see there, starts with bold H1s for headings. We've got tables, numbered lists, bulleted lists, things like that. That's to help try and bridge the gap between wiki markup and rich text editors. So, as I may have mentioned, no more wiki markup in Confluence 4.0. Okay? We're introducing a lot of keyboard shortcut support in 3.4. This is carrying through and being built up for 4.0. So those power users out there, you shouldn't have to take your hands off the keyboard when formatting and writing up your wiki pages. It should be all on the keyboard. Get shortcuts for everything. Whilst I said we've got no more wiki markup, we do have legacy support for inserting wiki markup. We've got a new dialog there where you can insert snippets of wiki markup. We'll migrate it on the fly and it'll be inserted as rich text into the editor. And you can see that fourth point there. We've got many wiki markup fanatics at Atlassian. I was one of them, okay? We have to satisfy them all before we can be happy to get this out to you, okay? Mike said it at Summit, we've got to get everyone at home happy. So, with 4.0, we introduce this new storage format. As you know, currently with Confluence, everything in the database is stored as wiki markup. As you can see here, I've said it before, harp on about it again, no more wiki markup for 4.0. What we have now is a custom XHTML. So it's XHTML with custom namespaces, number of custom namespaces for our elements there. And what we're going to do is provide an API for all you plugin developers to be able to interact with that XHTML without actually have to worry about parsing XML, things like that. So a bit more on the API later. Just going to go through a few examples of what it looks like in pre-4.0 and what it's going to look like in 4.0. So here you can see the wiki markup, good old heading tag, H3. This one, pretty easy. Transfers across just to a bunch of H3 tags. Okay, things get a little bit more complex with links. We've got links here, title and a destination, so destination being home. With this, comes over to XHTML like this. And this is where you can see the custom namespaces and root element tag there, link, as well as another AC link body, which is the body of the link, as well as the resource identifier. So with all our links, they actually link to what we call a resource identifier. And in this case, it is the identifier for a page. We we provide resource identifiers for all the constructs in Confluence. This is just an example of the page. You can see the attributes, the space key, and the content title. Moving on, we also have to migrate macros and have the XHTML for that. In this case, got a good old code macro. You can see some Java code with a title, a bunch of Java code in the middle of it. This comes across to the macro element. Okay, so all macros in Confluence 4.0 are going to be represented by the AC macro element tag in the storage format. We can see the attribute on it for code, 0 to n parameter elements, and a single default parameter element, just like you had in your wiki markup for macros. Also, things to note here is that the body of the macros are all stored in C data tags. So, moving on from that, during our migration, we also ran into the problem of how do we migrate macros such as the color. I'm sure you've all used the color macro to format some text into a certain color. In this case, we don't need actual macros for it in the storage format. We can do this simply with, in this case, a span tag and setting the style on it. So we have the concept of replacement renderers, which will go through migration, rip out any color macros, and convert them to this. So the storage format for the color macro is the span tag there. We have a bit of a problem with running into macros that have been disabled or non-existent. So with these macros here, we wrap them in a new macro for Confluence 4.0, which is called unmigrated wiki markup. This unmigrated wiki markup macro actually takes the body of it, which you can see there is all the wiki markup defined above, and it runs it through the V2 renderer or the wiki markup renderer to output it. In this case, if the macro is disabled, it means that you'll get the macro not found error on the page. However, if this macro does enable once again, then this will render correctly as it did in previous versions. So moving away from that and onto the API. So before we get into the actual API, there's a few changes that have been made to Confluence. So you may be aware of the content ND object and the body content, where all content is stored in Confluence. We've now added a body type member onto this. What this means is that the actual body content objects are now typed. So as you can see in the second point there, we have the 3 types at the moment: wiki markup, XHTML, and mail. These are pre-populated when upgrading an instance, so the column is added onto the table and we go through, do a bit of inspection and set the initial value for it. And the reason we did this is so that when you're migrating, if you cancel the migration halfway through, it fails for some reason or another, or you're looking at historical versions of pages, we can detect what that content is and run the appropriate migration, because you don't want to double migrate XHTML data. You get a mess. But I'll go a bit more into migration a bit later. Along with that, we've also removed the getContent method from the content entity object. And what this means is that for any of you guys out there that are writing plugins that operate on the content inside Confluence, that this method will no longer be present and it will actually break your plugin in 4.0. You won't be able to compile against it. Okay, this is done intentionally because getContent returns wiki markup. In this case, we're going to be returning XHTML data, and you're not going to want to try and pass XHTML like you pass wiki markup. So we've added the getBodyAsString method. And it's a similar case for setContent and setBodyAsString. They've been replaced as well. We've also introduced a new bean that we're exposing to the plugins. Okay? And you can see there it's called XHTML content. And this is for performing the common operations you'd normally do on the storage format itself, as well as providing access to migration services for migrating wiki markup yourself into the XHTML storage format. Okay, this is because we want to provide an API for you guys so that whilst you're aware that the content is XHTML, you should not have to be there passing it and instantiating your XML passes, things like that. You should just be able to operate on it with POJOs, no other dramas like that. It's not complete yet, but we want to get it complete for the release. This brings us on to migration. Okay, when an instance is upgraded, we need to migrate the content, okay? Pretty simple, because wiki markup in the old one, we want to bring it over to XHTML. What that means is running the wiki markup through our custom process and outputting the XHTML. With this, we don't actually touch any of your historical data. So current versions, all the previous versions, they don't get touched. What we do is we take the current version of any object, run it through our migrator, and add a new version for that marked as XHTML. And this is where that typed body content comes back in. So you've got the very latest version which we've migrated as XHTML, and all the previous versions as wiki markup. And the idea there is if you go to view a previous version, we'll migrate it on the fly. So you as a developer, any page you're requesting, you can be sure that it's going to be coming back as XHTML, even if it's stored as wiki in the database. And as I said before, we do this, we use a custom renderer. So we've built a renderer, wired it up with special XHTML rendering components so that when we render the wiki markup, it actually outputs the XHTML. So I mentioned it before, we've got the unmigrated wiki markup macro. And so anything that cannot get migrated, any invalid wiki markup, disabled macros, things like that, that just won't work through the renderer, we actually catch that and wrap it in this unmigrated wiki markup block. So that means any content that you had in the previous version of the page, it all comes across. So we're not discarding anything or throwing anything away. It all comes across. We don't want any of that data to be lost. So moving on from standard migration of content, we also have this special case which is migrating the macros, and that's what I'm going to dig into a bit deeper here. Macros, we've got a new macro interface for 4.0. So that means your old macros, to get them fully 4.0 compliant, are going to have to implement this new interface and be built for 4.0. You can see that second point, they don't have to be 4 macros to be migrated. There is a slight case there, which I'll go through. I've got a flowchart for you so you can see. But most of your bodied macros, yes, they're going to have to be upgraded to to support Confluence 4.0. We also provide mechanisms for developers to provide their own custom migration paths. And an example here is our exert include macro. Everyone familiar with the exert include macro? Yeah, at least one. Okay. So the way the exert include macro worked was any excerpts were stored in the property store. The new version of the exert include macro doesn't use this. It doesn't use the property store. So during migration, we wanted to go through and clear out all those entries in there. We used a custom migrator for this. So the macro migration flowchart. Looking at the start bubble there, if we move to the first decision element, is the macro you've got XHTML? So is it a 4.0 macro? Has it been upgraded? Does it implement this new interface? And is it defined with the new module descriptor? If it is, that's fantastic. Does it have a custom migration implementation? Yes, use that. Otherwise, we'll go through the automatic migration procedure. However, if it's not XHTML, is the macro bodiless? Okay, bodiless macros, we can wrap in a special 4.0 wrapper and we can migrate them correctly. So we'll go through the automatic migration. However, if it's not, they're going to get wrapped up in the unmigrated wiki markup macro that you saw. So that means that these macros, they'll be wrapped in the unmigrated wiki markup macro and they'll be executed using the V2 renderer or the old wiki markup renderer, the same as they do at the moment for 3x. And just to note, as you can see those dotted boxes around it, the preferred method is to have an XHTML macro. And the bottom part will be deprecated, not at the moment, but it is planned for the future sometime. So the way automatic migration works of macros is we check whether the body type is plain text or rich text, because there's 2 different migration operations that have to happen there. And we have provided both the migrators for those cases. So if it's plain text, we use the plain text macro migrator. If it's rich text, we use the rich text macro migrator. Pretty straightforward there. However, if you have a custom migration implementation, which implements the macro migrator interface, then we will run that instead of one of these other ones. So it's up to your migrator to do the full migration of the macro. You can always delegate to one of ours anyway. So I want to run through a bit of a demo with you now, but I'll just explain it. This is the scenario. I've got 2 3.x macros, and I want to upgrade these to 4.0 macros. And because I was a bit of a doob when I did the second one, I put all the parameters in the body of it, so I want to fix that up as well. So the first one is the myCheese macro. A lot like the cheese macro, except it outputs I really like cheese. Nothing special there. The second one is the myColor macro. It takes the parameter inside the body there and outputs the rest of the body in that color. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the project at the moment. If you have a look here, this is your Atlassian plugin XML file, this one here. We can see both the macro definitions there, one for myCheese, and it implements the myCheese macro. One for myColor, and it implements the class myColor macro. You can see these two exist on the left here, as well as the plugin's XML just there. Looking at the body of the myCheese macro implementation, it is very, very simple. It simply returns the string, I really like cheese. Okay? Nice brain-dead macro. The myColor macro, however, is a little bit more complex. You can see it has a body, and the execute method does a bit of manipulation on that body to extract the first parameter before the colon, use that as the color, and format a string in that span with that body. So it'll output the rest of the body in that color. Now what I'm going to do is show you these two macros in operation. So if we remember back to that flowchart, you'll see that the myCheese macro, it doesn't have a body. So that should automatically appear in our autocomplete, in our macro browser, everywhere else where 4.0 macros will appear. The myColor macro does not have that. It's not XHTML, and it does have a body. So that means we're not going to see it in the macro browser, we're not going to see it in the autocomplete, and it's going to get wrapped in that unmigrated wiki markup macro that I spoke about earlier. So let's go ahead and add a page. Spell it correctly. So, looking at our autocomplete, we'll start with my, and we can see the myCheese macro, even though it's a 3x macro, exists in our autocomplete. And we can insert it through the macro browser, and we get the appropriate placeholder for it. Using the insert wiki markup dialog, we can do a similar thing. This is where I talked about before, where you can type in wiki markup, click insert, it'll do a migration on the fly and insert that rich text into the editor. So let's go ahead with myCheese. And then we can see, now we have two placeholders. Now if you go back to the autocomplete, we'll notice that the myColor macro doesn't exist there. We can't see it there. Can you see that down the back all right? Yep, excellent. Okay, we can see that the myColor macro doesn't exist in the autocomplete. So I'm going to try and insert that through the insert wiki markup dialog. And we can see it appears in this macro placeholder titled unmigrated wiki markup. And all that is a plain text bodied macro that takes wiki markup and renders it with the v2 or wiki markup renderer. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And you can see those three macros, all of them 3x macros, have been rendered correctly. Now, me being the plugin developer, I want to go ahead and I want to upgrade my myColor macro to support 4.0, to be a 4.0 macro. So the first thing we're going to do there is in our myColor macro, and we can do this in the same class that is currently supporting the 3x macro, and I will. So we're just going to implement the new macro interface. I've already got it in my import, so I picked it up. All of this will be available afterwards if anyone's keen on seeing that. All this interface does is provide three new methods that are used by Confluence 4.0. The body type is for the body type of the macro. In this case, we're going with plain text. We don't need rich text in our macro. And in this, the output type is whether it's block or inline. We're just going to go with block for this example. Now, our execute method, as you can see, our execute for the 3x macro, pretty straightforward, doesn't even use the context. So, being lazy, I'm just going to delegate to that. If I can spell correctly. So looking there, I've just, scroll down a bit for you. My 4.0 execute method is just delegating back to the 3x version. The signature's a little different, throws a different exception and takes a render context instead of a conversion context. However, for the time being, that should be fine. Now, we've got the 4.0 implementation in our macro, but what we need to do now is to add the custom module descriptor for it. Add the XHTML macro module descriptor for it. And that's what we're going to do now. So looking back at our our Atlassian plugins XML, we can see the two macro definitions for my cheese and for my color. Confluence 4.0 actually introduces a new module descriptor, and that is the XHTML macro module descriptor. And this one I prepared earlier. As you can see there, it is extremely similar to the macro module descriptor. Main differences to note are the element are different. We have XHTML macro as opposed to macro. The key is different because the keys are unique. And the class, the class is the same and the name is the same. So we've got that there. I'm just going to save that and we're going to install this. This is all running on amps, by the way, so you can just link it to the new Confluence and it all works as normal. There we go. We've installed that. So going back to our demo page, I'd just like to refresh that. As you can see, it still works, so nothing has really changed there. We're still using the unmigrated wiki markup. So looking at the source, I just want to show you this. We can see that the mycheese macro, that was correctly migrated and exists as an AC macro in the storage format. Again, we have two instances of that. One was through the macro browser, one was through the insert wiki markup. We can also see this part here, the unmigrated wiki markup macro, and that has the mycolor wiki markup inside it, and that was when the macro was a 3x macro, not a 4.0. So what we're going to do now, we've got a 4.0 implementation of our mycolor macro. If you think back to that flowchart, moving to the first decision bubble, is the macro XHTML compatible? In this case, yes it is. So we should see it. There it is. mycolor macro existing in the autocomplete. You can insert it and insert it through the macro browser. In this case, we still have the parameters inside the body of it. I'll call it this is green. I'd also like to show you is through the insert wiki markup dialog. We can insert it as well, and this will actually be migrated to a mycolor macro, as you can see there. Blue, this is blue, a mycolor macro placeholder. So saving these, you can see this text is rendered correctly, and these two instances are rendered through the new code we implemented just then, through the new macro interface. And if you don't believe me, I can show you the new placeholders for it. So here we have the storage format for the mycolor macro, and as you can see, the macro name is mycolor. We still have this one down the bottom because this page has not been migrated, okay? So this sits just there. Now what we want to do is this macro, it's not great at all. You take, in the body of it, you take the parameter, and that's not fantastic. Given we got the macro browser, we can define a set of custom parameters, or a small set of parameters that this macro is capable of taking, give the user a better experience for it, and just not have that messy stuff inside the body of the macro. So what we want to do now is, I want to implement this using the parameters collection and take out the color parameter and use it there. So what I'm going to do here So we're just doing a check. If it doesn't contain it, we just send back the body. Otherwise, so rather than splitting the body of the macro up and extracting the color, we're going to take that color out of the parameters collection. Now, whilst that works fine here, the parameter isn't actually in the macro parameters yet. So the color isn't actually in the macro parameters yet. What we want to do now is, in our Atlassian plugins XML, we've got this parameters here. We're going to define a fixed set of parameters that this macro can take that are going to be exposed inside the macro browser. And again, one I prepared earlier. We've got this fixed set of parameters. You can see it's just an enumeration. We've got red, green, blue, pink, and black. So these guys are all good. We still have the problem, though, of when a user inserts either wiki markup or you migrate a previous instance of Confluence using this macro, we want to take that parameter out of the body, remove it from the body completely, and stick it into the parameters collection. And the way we're going to do this is using one of the custom migrators I spoke about earlier. And I'm not going to type it all out in front of you. Here we have I mentioned the macro migration interface earlier. This is all it is. Well, this is all an implementation of it is. The macro migration interface just defines a single method called migrate. It takes a macro definition and a context, and it returns a macro definition. And all it wants to do is, it says, when given this, how do you want me to write it back? So in this case, just quickly step through this. We take the body of it, of the current implementation of that macro. We do a lot similar to what we did in the 3x version. We split out, with this line here, we split out the color from the first item. We create a new parameters map and insert the color into it. Set the parameters on the new macro definition. Set a new body on it, which is the body minus that first color parameter, so we no longer have that ugliness in there. And we just return that back. So that's all our migration code is for this macro. Nice and simple. The thing we have to do now is simply define a module for a macro migrator in here and link it back to this XHTML macro. I've got one complete just there. I can't scroll down any further. So you can see we've got this new macro migrator module descriptor. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's one of the two new module descriptors we've got, XHTML macro and macro migrator. All it takes is, of course, a key, a name for the macro for it to operate against, and a class which is the implementation of this migration. Nice and simple there. So I'll save that, and what I want to do is show you this in action. So I'll just edit this page. I want to clear up a bit of room. Now, the first thing I'll show you is what those parameters in the Atlassian plugins XML did for us inside the macro browser. So I look at my color macro again, hit enter on that, and we can now see we have a color parameter up on the right-hand side there. I'm going to call this one green and insert it. Some green text. So that's just standard behavior. Now I want to execute the custom migrator we've implemented. So looking at the wiki markup there, can you see that right down the back? All good. Looking at the wiki markup there, we see it's the original format for the 3x version of the macro. We've got the parameter first in the body and the rest of the text. When I save this, it'll run it through our custom migrator we implemented and defined in our Atlassian plugins XML, and it will set the parameters in the storage format for it and remove it from the body of this. So we can see we've got the placeholder here. It's all looking good. We don't have the parameter in the body anymore. And if I edit that, you can see in our macro browser, we're set to color blue. Cancel that. So saving this, and looking at our storage format, we can see that's our blue one there. We can see it has the AC parameter element with the name of color and the color type, which is blue, as well as the body, which is then lacking the parameter at the start of it. So that shows during migration, which is done as an upgrade task, or using the insert wiki markup dialog, we can run these custom migrators and perform manipulations on the macro, the actual storage format of the macro themselves for fixing anything up. Or again, it's not actually restricted just to the macro definitions. As I said, with the exert include macro, you can operate on the properties store or do any other work that's required during the migration of your macro. So, as I said, that just went through upgrading some of my macros from 3x versions up to the 4.0 version. And again, the myCheese macro, nice and simple. Bodyless macro, remember that flowchart. If it's not XHTML and it doesn't have a body, then we can wrap it and migrate it automatically. However, if it does, then it's going to get wrapped in that unmigrated wiki markup macro, and you're going to have to provide your 4.0 implementation of it and or a custom migrator. So, everyone back to Sydney, we think Confluence 4.0 is going to rock. It's going to be awesome. We've got some awesome new features in there, the hybrid editing experience, things like that. It is going to be really cool. Did a brief look at the XHTML storage format, so how everything is stored in the database, the equivalents for the wiki markup ones. Quick look at the API. Key things to remember there is what we want is for you guys as plugin developers to be able to operate on the storage format without touching the XHTML. Using this API, just operating purely on the POJOs. That'd be really cool. Quick look at migration, just migration of content. There's a fair bit to that. I can go into that with anyone that wants to talk to me about it. And again, a bit more on the macro migration. And you saw the demo on migrating a bodyless macro, a bodied macro, as well as a custom migration implementation. So, there's a URL up there. And what that is an alpha version of Confluence 4.0 we're providing to everyone here at AtlasCamp. Okay? This is provided to you to assist us, the guys building it, with some feedback and how you guys can, I guess, work better as plugin developers. We want to hear what you have to say in terms of interacting with the storage format, the API, these new macro interfaces, things like that. Couple of things, those bottom 2 points. Don't go and install this on a production instance. And there's no upgrade path from this alpha. People, it's an alpha. Yeah, it's mainly for the plugin developers. We're not really looking at feedback in terms of UI and the editor experience at this stage. It's more how you interact with it as a plugin developer. You can also get this using, it's available through Maven and in AMPs. So simply using the version string 4.0 alpha 2, that'll get you Confluence 4.0 and you can start building against it. That link, by the way, it goes to a page, I guess a landing page for instructions on how to build macros, how to migrate macros, and a few new features of 4.0. Okay, anyone got any questions? Thanks. Okay, I'll take a few and then anyone can see me later. Yes?
Yeah, this is not really a plugin development question, but just I want to understand the flow. When I do Confluence pages, I sit there and I do it in the markup, and sometimes I'll do it in the rich editor. So for 4, obviously I'm not going to type all that XHTML unless I absolutely have to.
Yep.
So what do you see as for people who want to get a little more control? Is it going to be a beefed up rich editor, or what do you see there?
Well, that's where the concept of the, I guess the hybrid, there we go, the hybrid editing experience comes in. So just like you would type wiki markup, I can start typing things like that, and you immediately see the change there right in front of you. I can, things like that.
What did you do there to get heading?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, a bit fast. So we can get headings with simply the H1, hit the dot, space after it. It gives you the heading in the correct style and already selected, so you can talk like that or type like that. We just trying to remember all the shortcuts. There we go. We can use hashes to start bullet items. We can... tables with headings and various things like that. So it's not complete at the moment. Okay, it's still lacking a few of the wiki markup, I guess, constructs in the alpha version we've released. But the plan is to get it to a stage where any, I guess, wiki markup veteran can be able to type directly in there, and they see it migrating on the fly, and they see the output there in front of them instead of seeing the wiki markup. The idea behind the storage format is that that's just how it's stored in the database, and we don't want people to go and start typing directly in storage format.
So it's not that the markup is being deprecated, it's just not being used as a storage format, you're using it as this hinting for a hybrid heading.
I guess Is
that right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Okay.
Cool.
I was thinking maybe you could explain what the logic behind why we're making this big change in the editor a little bit.
Cool. Sorry.
Okay, couple of questions. In terms of release, do you have an EPA? The next question is, when is the EAP going to start, and how many weeks, months we're going to get between, early access and the final release?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. However, Sharif, up the back there, if you just want to put your hand up.
So dates and stuff, we really hope to have something up early next year for customers, but even later in the year for you guys, a more robust version of the alpha, you guys start testing stuff. So stay tuned for that. We don't have any exact dates at the moment, because that's the rough time.
So you're going to do source code?
The source will be available as always.
Is this still based on the same Moxie editor?
The rich text editor is based on the TinyMCE. Yeah. Sorry, hope that answered it. One more, and then, sorry, just a moment. Yeah, after this, then anyone wants to see me, feel free to approach me and talk to me, and I'll try and answer it as best as you can. If I can't, I'll find someone that can. Yes.
How does a user write H1 doc without it expanding to a heading?
Yeah, you got me there. Wait one. Yeah. Undo works just like in Word. So you can undo, again with the bold and things like that, table generation, things like that, you can undo and it'll step you back to before the automatic change was made.
Now when you save a round trip, it will stay H1 doc?
Yes, that was the move to XHTML fixed a lot of the a lot of the issues with round tripping things, because this is saved as content of the element tags, whereas as the H1, it is saved as the actual elements themselves. Yeah, of course. That'd be fantastic. It's one already on the list, so come if you want to discuss it, and I'll do my best to give you answers. So.